Thanks for tuning in to Maybe I'm Just Not Getting It. I'm your podcast host, Robert Davis. Really appreciate you all for tuning in this season. This is the season finale. So before we get into it, just want to take a second to plug myself on social media. Instagram is RTD underscore III. Facebook is Robert Trey Davis III. The podcast is on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, all as the name. Maybe I'm just not getting it. Robert Davis is the podcast host. Take a look in your own spare time. Really appreciate all the engagement, the positive feedback, the ideas, the requests to join the show. I'm going to be definitely in season 2 trying to look into some ways to incorporate some call-ins, guests, things of that nature, try to get it a little bit more interactive. But I appreciate you all listening to me again. I've had a blast doing this and hopefully have a blast doing more of it in the future. So in today's episode, this is kind of a rant, kind of not. It's more of a question for you all, the listeners, to consider in terms of just one that I'll pose it to you. I'll give my opinion, and again, hopefully, leaving this show would be something for you to think about in your own time. As a country in America, are we more racist or are we more sexist? That's the question that I'm posing today. That's really the topic of today's episode is, are we more racist or are we more sexist as a country? And so I think to start first, it's important to note that, we as a country, when I say we, I'm talking about America, our history is rooted in two sins probably more than any else, which is racism and sexism. That's the reason why I brought this particular question forward. And I think, it's important to define what those are. Racism in the sense of this conversation is more or less that thought of white supremacy, or that thought of one race being the Caucasian race kind of sitting in a position of power or privilege over other races strictly based upon the fact that their race is Caucasian. Sexism being a very similar thought of either subservience or a second place citizenness of women compared to men, out of the thought of male privilege. That maybe that kind of hyper emasculated traditional values of what you think a home should be, or hyper exaggerated type of examples of traditional values, and in terms of ways to try to keep women in a sense subservient to men. That's the more or less the example of sexism I'm bringing into this case as well, or into this question. And just to talk about what these systems benefit, I mean, it's quite obvious. Like, racism has always benefited the dominant race, and that has been in both genders, male and female. But it has always benefited the dominant race by trying to keep, through a majority of different systems, that, I don't want to call it master race, but that preferred race ahead, whether that be through cultural, demographic, socioeconomic, sociocultural, sociopolitical, it's a variety of different ways. But it's the benefit to that system has always been white people, male and female, but white people. And I think on the flip side, when we talk about what the sexism benefit, I mean, that's pretty obvious. It benefits men, men across across that racial board, for the most part, because sexism is been displayed in the white community. It's been displayed in Black, Hispanic, Asian. Almost every demographic has their own kind of internal structure when it comes to gender, sexism, everything like that. And so who it benefits generally has been the male privilege. White privilege and male privilege are essentially the back factors to this conversation in terms of what these two systems perpetuate. And so the question coming back to it is, well, which one is America more and why? I think it's important, in terms of that, first to say that I don't speak about this in terms of a competition or one needs to be better or more or is more deserving than the other. No, it's just a honestly, just a thought and an honest question on which do we believe that this country inhibits or prohibits more of, not prohibits, shows more of, exhibits more of. I personally believe it's sexism. I know that's going to be weird as somebody that is pro racial knowledge and pro black as I am to say that I believe sexism takes the first class seat to racism in this example, but not because I believe racism isn't a huge problem or a prevalent issue, because I believe it is. I just believe, if for honestly, the reason, quite simply, the reason that I gave earlier, within every culture, every demographic culture, no matter the race, there is sexism. And I think, you know, that sort of existence, regardless of the race, is what makes it to me more, makes the country more sexist, because it exists in so many more different pockets. And not to say like white women can be racist just as white men can be racist, just as Hispanic men, Hispanic women, black women. But I do think that racism it caps off at a certain point in terms of who's doing it. While I think sexism is a lot more broad. And so, well, why does this matter? I mean, it's in terms of this hypothetical question. Well, I mean, I think, we're talking about two of the biggest systems in America that have historically impacted our society. Two of the biggest civil rights crowning points in this country has been, you know, on one side, the making illegal or freeing of slaves, the granting of civil rights of African Americans' ability to vote. That has been one, that whole, I don't want to say that whole movement because it's much more than just like trying to summarize into a movement. But that whole concept has been one that America has been fighting and struggling with for a long time. And on the flip side, one that has just been just as prevalent. I mean, because I think women got the right to vote before black people in this country. That, but it's still, that concept came way after white men had it. And sexism is that other standpoint, where it's always been that concept of how do we keep this class women controlled, how do we keep them quiet or subservient, how do we keep them in a position to where they can stay of value to us and not rise out of that box, kind of. That's always been the similar, like the issue with that. And in order for us to move forward as a society, we have to address those two systems. I mean, we have to address more than just those two systems, but those are two definite that have to be kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Those are two that definitely have to be talked about, that have to be rectified in order, especially in this era where we have so much diversity, so many people from so many different walks of life succeeding, reaching new heights, whether that's in their career, whether that's in their social element, whether that is with their family, for a variety of different reasons. And it's bringing people into different spaces that others weren't comfortable with them being in, for one reason or the other. And as we move into this new era, and I ain't even gonna say a new era because it's been happening. As we move into this era of more diversity and universal existence of different types of people, these have to be addressed in order for us to move forward. And I think that racism is more or less another reason I brought up this question was I think racism is more or less what we see heavily through the eyes of the law, whether that is legally or illegally, whether that is, through redlining, whether that's through police brutality, police harassment, whether that is through educational, defunding certain districts because of their demographics and, the defunding schools in minority areas, defunding community programs and events in minority areas, defund, limiting, creating food deserts, just limiting the access to healthy and affordable food in minority areas. I think the system, the law, and the actual systems in place work very hard to keep a lot of racial advantages in place. And I think that is where we see so much, where somebody could be like, well, racism is to me the bigger issue. I could understand that because of the fact that these systems are in place that still enforce that, that racial construction, that racism construction so heavily. And with, like I said, it's more of a systematic problem with racism to me, because a lot of these issues where African Americans, or even taking it just outside of African Americans, where people of different minorities, especially not white, are seemingly not afforded the same sort of opportunities or the same access to things that would happen if they were white, or seems to have barriers put up that would not happen if they were white. That to me is, a huge issue, but that is to me a much more of a systematic problem. While sexism, I think, is more cultural. And don't get me wrong, racism is a cultural issue too, because there's still a lot of people that just don't want black people around them for the sake of, they don't believe that they're equal. They don't believe, they shouldn't be here, what, blah, blah, or, Mexicans, Indians, Native Americans, Middle Eastern, whatever the case may be. Like, there's still a lot of that where it's just but it's rare. It's not more rare, but it's easier and it's more spoken out against now. And I think that's because, people are a lot more used to working and living in more diverse areas. They're used to having children, grandchildren that come from diverse backgrounds because of interracial marriages and interracial dating. I think sexism is a lot more through the culture and the concept of, the structure that are in place to kind of, I think, a lot of times keep women subservient are much more to where it's not like there's a law here, or there's a law that's built to benefit men as much as men are already in control of it, and therefore they can more or less keep a woman from accessing it. And I think I might be sounding confusing in that. Like, for example, I'll take banking, for example. Like, a bank might, like back in the day where African Americans weren't allowed access to certain banks, that was strictly because there was a law in place saying that you weren't allowed access to this bank. Or they might have a system in place to say, oh, if you're black, we'll run you through these sort of tests to say you don't qualify, you don't have the credit score, blah, 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 blah. There's an actual system in place to do that. While culturally, I think with women, that thing has been more, you don't need a bank account, your husband will just handle it. Whether they wanted their husband to handle it or not, that's what they were told. Or you need to have your husband here in order to do this business. And while that wasn't a system per se, that was more of a cultural force. I think a lot of times politically, the cultural forces, they think, oh, well, women will just vote the way of their husband. And I think, that was more or less what the cultural dependence upon was, and keeping, like, and from a voting standpoint, a lot of sexist things going, compared to, we have to keep different races from the polls, which that was more of a systemic issue, where it was trying to keep minorities out of the polls. While it's like, well, women can vote, but we just thinking we're going to encourage them to vote the way their husbands, or encourage their husbands to run their households. And I think, they're both ways of control. But I think sexism is a lot more through the culture, which is a lot more dangerous because I think, I'm going to not say a lot more dangerous. I think it is dangerous in the fact that it is harder to map out because it's culturally, it's internally, where it's like, oh no, that misogyny comes out more or less in the thing that this is just how things should go, while the racism comes out of this is how we're writing it to go. But both systems do speak to the privilege of more or less the white male. And I think it's also important to understand that we're talking about this because that does matter. That at the end of the day, both of these systems were created in order to solidify the position of the white male by keeping other people in a less advantageous position than they are. And it speaks to America's love of classification and division. I mean, we find a way, and I've talked about this in past episodes, we find a way to classify and divide each other in almost any sense that we can. We find a way to try to separate ourselves to say, oh, we're not this group, or we're better than this group, or we did things differently than this group. And I think that, sexism and racism are just two more ways of doing that. And the reason why these systems have stayed in place for so long is because they do feed into America's love of that, and especially that white male privilege love of that, of just ways of trying to divide each other up. And so we talk about, some examples. If you hear me say, well, I believe sexism is more inherently deeper in this country than racism. And I think that's about a very small margin. I think we're comparing, it's like choice A versus choice 1 here in a sense. But some examples of that is, I think, what I brought before as far as my number one kind of example of it is that sexism exists within minority communities. There's a sexism and misogyny that exists within, Hispanic culture, within Middle Eastern culture, within Black culture, within white culture, within Asian culture. And I think that quite generally from a male perspective, it just seems to me that a lot of times the thought is, no matter what, this woman is supposed to be listening to me. Like, regardless of race, regardless of where we are, And there are cultures where women are the dominant aggressor of the gender, or I don't want to say breadwinner because women are breadwinners here, but there are where they are the dominant, the decision maker, more than just that head of household. Even though head of household is still a good example here, but I think because we have so many cultures that exist in, regardless of race, in this concept of the woman is subservient to the man through this misogynistic lens of, I as male should be running things because I am male, bigger, stronger. I think that is what always, for me, will make the argument that sexism is inherently more at play in this country than racism. Now, also, I believe that is based upon those traditional values. And I think the reason I say that, and I kind of air quote traditional in that sense, is that because I think racism is kind of built in that same sense too, but it's not. It's been made publicly. Racism in a historical traditional value sense has been made taboo. That, yes, in the 1800s, it was traditionally culturally acceptable to be racist because everybody was racist openly. Like, why is there a nigger in my store? Get him out of here, type. And while that's the case, and while you may still see some people thinking like that now, it is taboo and not acceptable now from a cultural standpoint for me to just say, oh, I walked in this restaurant, why is there a nigger in here eating with me? While at the same, there is still this cultural these traditional values that still exist in a larger sense or a more tangible sense to women. I think, a woman being in any sort of field that, I mean, for first, I mean, just now, this is almost so the same as races. There are many fields that are still extremely male dominated, still extremely white dominated, but extremely male dominated. And women in those fields often face microaggressions, the same as racism, microaggressions, transgressions, maybe even, I don't know if that is a microaggression, maybe where it's something that comes across the insult where that person might not even admit it, but they don't have that knowledge of who they're speaking to, or just or that cultural IQ to even understand it. And I think a lot of these values, I mean, when you see women in these fields and they're dealing with these sort of things, it's because a lot of traditional type of thoughts that women shouldn't be in certain fields still exist. Or it's even the concept of motherhood, or yes, you as the mom, even you could still be the breadwinner. You could be working 60 hours a week and you're still looked at to come home and, cook, clean for your husband who may be working the same, may not. I think, those values still exist where it's not like, as a black person, I see people looking like, well, the only thing you're supposed to be doing is sharecropping. Don't get me wrong. The concept of still trying to limit black men's goals and aspirations to physical trade positions is still very prevalent in this country. But I think but it's still that thought that, oh, you as a black male can't be a lawyer, a doctor, so on and so forth, is not as taboo as much as you as a woman. If you're a mother, then shouldn't you be doing that? Why are you doing other things? Or shouldn't you want to have a family? Shouldn't that be what you're doing? And I think those traditional type of values of where people believe a woman's place is still exist in a much more tangible way than where they believe you as a black person or person of color exists. And to speak about an example, I think Trump is a good example of this because, for one, I can't use it in a racist example because he never ran presidentially against a person of color. Well, I guess he did in the sense of his primaries. But while racism wasn't as much the thing there, it definitely was sexism. Trump ran 3 times, and I mean, really almost 4 because he tried to run against Obama. The only time that he gained considerable success and wasn't looked at and kind of laughed at in terms of his presidency was when he ran against women. It's because of the concept, I really think, that his base, that running against a woman, for some odd reason, that sexism type of background to it made him more appealing. I don't know if it was because of his sexist behavior or because of his ability to kind of be like the misogynistic bully toward the women and pointing out something that maybe they agreed with. But it's his only times winning were against women. And I think that sexist type of behavior plays into that. On the flip side, I think that sexist behavior plays into his support because his support was not that big against Biden, and definitely was minimal when he was trying to get his stuff off the ground with Obama. And so I think just that it was a lot easier for people to support him running against a woman because of the fact that against a man he was looked at as like, oh, look at this, this weak, silly man. But against a woman, it was, oh, he's still a man. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of went with that. On the flip side, for the racist example, I think that's the difference between the campaigns for the women that he ran against, and Hillary and Kamala. I mean, I think Hillary Clinton is probably the most decorated politician career-wise to run for president in terms of her resume. She had a lot of mistrust against her. And Kamala, also similar, even though she didn't have the same political resume, her political resume was still very top notch as a former district attorney, the prosecutor, state of California. Like, this is, a senator. This is not somebody who just lucked up into the role. Like, this is somebody who is a career politician now. And I think, you know, she also had a level of mistrust that was put on her. Both her and Hillary had a level of mistrust that was put on them due to the person they were running against. But the outcome of the campaigns were drastically different. Hillary, for all intents and purposes, got cheated. I mean, she won and popular, lost the electoral vote because they had to go to they really had to win it by the system, by the electoral college system more than anything else. While against Kamala, they won in surprising numbers flat out. Whether you looked at it from the popular vote, whether you looked at it from the electoral college vote, whether you looked at it from how people felt about it coming into the election. And I think the reason for that is more of where that racism kind of lies. Is I think a lot of people had a lot more issue. And don't get me wrong, Hillary also fully ran. Kamala was more or less put into the position of running. So I think there are some back forces, some other forces to that could be examined. But Kamala resounding loss to me, and the lack of support that she got compared to Hillary is based upon the fact that I think a lot of people had a lot more. I think a lot of people felt a lot more comfortable voting for Hillary, not just because of the name, because of her past, but just because of the fact that she was white compared to Kamala. Let me not say that. I think Kamala had a higher bar to clear to gain people's support than Hillary Clinton. And I think race was part of that. I think obviously the Clinton name, her being head of state, secretary of state, and all these different positions were pretty high. I think, but also Kamala being your vice president was pretty high. I think it was just that bar to clear to gain people's trust and support was higher for Kamala because of her race. And I don't think that would have won her the election one way or the other. But I do think that it was just that lack of support. A part of that pushback is because of that. Another thing I'm going to talk about is and I'm not going to go too deep into this particular topic, but LGBTQ is almost the pushback behind towards LGBTQ is a representation of sexism, because LGBTQ is gender based upon your sexual orientation, and it is a concept of gender based upon your sexual orientation. But I think a lot of that representation or a lot of that pushback is because of the fact that I think a lot of people don't understand it, so they find it to be taboo or weird or whatever they want to call it. But I do think a part of it is rooted in that sexist type of thing, that you have people doing whatever they want, and a lot of them represent as women. And either way, to a lot of men, if a man transitioned to a woman, then they have embraced femininity. If a woman transitions to a man, then in a lot of these men's eyes, they're not men, and they're still feminine. And I think that existence of that femininity and kind of that embrace, because a lot of LGBTQ comes from a place of having to be very hesitant or very concerned with the hetero male gaze or existence, because that is seen to be a threat, not in the sense of, oh, they don't like us, but seen to be like a physical threat, a threat to their safety a lot of times. And I think that lies in that base of sexism, or that seeing women doing something that I don't approve of, or seeing somebody that I believe in a feminine space that I don't approve of, that is telling me that, they're going to do what I don't approve of. And I think that's where a lot of that comes in at. That pushback, I should say. We've seen things apply to both. Financial dependence. I talked about that. I think I think there's been ways to try to get. There's been a lot of different ways to try to limit the financial independence or ability of people of color, And I think, like I said, I think generally for women, it has always been trying to restrict their options or their ability to depending on their husband or depending on their father, their brother, whoever the male of their life is. I think it's the same with housing. I almost think it's this, in terms of trying on the sexist side, trying to limit the options to the male, to where that woman has to depend on whoever the male of her life is. On the flip side for race, it is trying to limit access and ability to have fair housing. Violence, I think, is where it is one as well. I mean, I think we do have a lot of. Well, I think violence is one where I think we do have a lot of violence based upon race, but again, it's still more taboo. Hate, I mean, because it's a hate crime. You know, domestic violence, on the other hand, is normalized. Not, and I don't mean normalized in the sense of yes, you go to jail and it'll be treated as a serious crime, but I could beat my wife, and that's not a front page topic. But if I beat a Hispanic man because he was Hispanic and called him all sorts of slurs, that's a front page topic. And so I think that you know just that existence in the world of violence speaks very heavily to why I think sexism is more of a problem. I don't want to say more of a problem. It's more it runs deeper in this country to me than racism. And then just talking about that male privilege. I mean, and where I was talking about the financial dependence, the housing, the violence. It just as three different examples of other fields of where these two type of systems exist. I think you're always going to have one half of it, these systems existing to try to again keep men in a sense of or in a place of advantage, which is that sexism, and then to keep white people in a sense of advantage, which is a sense of racism. And I do think almost in every, I use finance, housing, and violence, and just general violence as three examples where you can talk about how these two exist. I don't want to say compare because it's not a competition, but you can see kind of like the levels of pushback on them. But I do think when you look at these, while I think that white privilege is more, it's still very prevalent. I still think that's more of a taboo subject, where I think male privilege is still more of a tangible thing to deal with. Not to deal with, because you have to deal with both. A tangible thing that is shown, that I think it's more of a tangible thing that women have to more in their face deal with. Now, black people do have to deal with these issues of being, like black in an all white room. That's still very prevalent. I and I think that those problems exist, but I do think that sexism is still inherently easier for people to do, and I think inherently easier for people to get around being caught in a way. And so that brings to like what concerns that we have about this. Well, first, and I've talked about this in past episodes, is the lack of empathy in our society. And what I bring up in that is that it's increased the existence of these systems as jokes and trends. Like on the internet, everybody does sexist and racist jokes. It used to be, again, it used to be a taboo thing of comedy where only, like your edgy comedians or your edgy TV shows really went so hard into it. But now I think because of our society has come into this lack of empathy type of time, it is a lot more prevalent in terms of just a joking sense. And I think that's it's not like that in itself is an issue, but the problem becomes is that the more that it becomes an easier topic to joke about, all jokes contain an element of truth. And the problem that we see with Trump and stuff, they're saying, oh, we say this in jest, we say this in exaggeration, but they mean it to some degree in truth. And I think that's the same problem here, is that we're seeing an increase in a lot of this stuff while some of it is being taken truthfully or taken seriously. And that's the impact from joking about these things so much like we do now. And I get part of it is because, people are trying to find humor as a way of getting through the day. But it does take the seriousness out of a lot of it. And I think when we talk about these situations and these systems that do seriously put people's livelihoods and their lives in jeopardy, that we do have to, I don't want to say we do have to just to be completely serious about it. We do, but like there has to be a line somewhere, to where we can be entertained by things, but not be completely disrespectful of it or completely insensitive to what people are going through, or make it seem or normalize these type of topics through consistently joking about it. And I think that's a part of the problem now. And I think it's when we talk about, well, is America more sexist or racist? And we talk about how both of these systems are inherently huge problems, then one of the biggest issues that we come across to talk about is the fact that women, where does that leave women of color? So if we're saying that, America hates people of color and America hates women, women of color are at the bottom of that list. And I don't say America hates, but America seems to have a displeasure of that. Then women of color are at the bottom of that list. And I think, that leads, you don't want America to feel like a hierarchy of citizens anyway. Like, oh, white men are first, white women are second, Asian men are third, black men are fourth. Like, you don't want it to come into this hierarchy system. But realistically, when you think about it, if there was one, I'm assuming that women of color would be going down the list at the bottom because of that. And as a black male, that's something to think about in terms of my wife, in terms of my mother, in terms of my family members, in terms of the people I work with. Like, how does that, the women that I work with, I should say, how does that impact them? Impact their ability to succeed, impact their ability to live the life that they want to enjoy the life that they want to. And how do we address these systems to make the world easier for them? Because I would think in terms of making it easier for them, it would also make it easier for me as well. And that leads to the next point of just how will these systems advance or develop in the future? And when I say advance or develop, I can use racism as a very key point for this. Racism is no longer, I think, like I was saying, like the Ku Klux Klansman type of racism. That old school version of it, I think, is gone because it's taboo now. It's not socially acceptable to be overtly racist. But that doesn't mean that racial constructions that are built to supplement white privilege aren't still in place. They don't mean that they ever stopped either. And because of that, they became more advanced. They became more subliminal. They became a lot more indirect. And I think that there's examples of that regarding sexism as well. And as we come into an advancing culture where these sorts of discrimination become more taboo, it's always going to be a pushback, or anytime you try to challenge a system of superiority, there's always going to be a pushback trying to keep that system in place. And so what does that pushback look like in the future? How do these systems advance or develop in ways that are more indirect, that are more subliminal, that are but still yet finding ways to keep those those in that advantageous positions in power? It'll be interesting to see. I think we see it in the law in terms of how they phrase things a lot more. I think we see it in the law in terms of the repeal of anything that's regarding DEI, or helping a specific group, especially an underutilized or underprivileged group. And I think that we're seeing the flip of equality in a way to hurt those not at the top, compared to how equality was always used as a way to help those. So, with that in conclusion, the question of, to me, is America more sexist or racist? The answer to me is more sexist, because to me, male privilege, or that misogyny, or that existence of those misogynistic traditional values exist in every racial or demographic, while racism, I think, to a degree, is fighting to remain. I don't think it's fighting to remain a hot topic, but certain elements of racism are fighting to not be taboo. I think racism has had to try to find ways to rebrand itself to be more indirect, in ways that sexism just doesn't have to. It can be more bland and more blatant. And to me, that's what makes America more sexist. And again, it's important to note that this isn't a competition in terms of how I'm talking about it. The goal is to eliminate both systems, but I think in order to do so, we have to address where both stand in this country and how they impact its citizens for the worst. And as diversity increases, as we talked about, the systems will be challenged more. We will see more people of color, more women. We will see more people that don't fit that traditional white male norm in positions where they weren't in before, or in areas and fields where access to that was difficult for them before. And so these systems will be challenged more, both culturally and systemically. And so it's important for us to realize that, because if you're a supporter of diversity, it's important to realize that, because you know what you're coming into, and you know that people are starting to make it, and they've been making it for years, but people are more and bigger numbers starting to make it, and it's important to be an ally, and to be and to help where you can. And if you are against this diversity, whether it's racially or gender wise, whatever the case may be, then it's important for you to realize that time is up. It's not like more people, like those systems that were in place are not working the same as they are now. And so one way or the other, things have to change. And so I appreciate you all tuning in. Again, this is the season finale. Maybe I'm just not getting it. I'm your podcast host, Robert Davis. We'll be taking a few weeks off. Definitely be on the lookout for when season 2 drops. I'm going to try to incorporate some, listener feedback, call-ins, some guests. Really try to, some new stuff out next season. But I appreciate you all tuning in. I've really enjoyed doing this show. I've enjoyed, conversing with you all. The feedback that you've given has meant a lot to me. And yeah, I'll see y'all in season 2. Appreciate it. God bless.